later, everything old is new again. Stephen King. Although he's not the first to say it. Long ago, when I was just a baby political science student in college, I found the theories of Neil Howe and William Strauss, called, easily enough, Strauss-Howe Generational Theory. The whole idea here, basically stated, is that history continues in these sort of 80 to 100 year cycles where we all make the same categories of successes and mistakes. Not the same successes and mistakes, mind you, but generally related ones. And within those cycles of successes and mistakes, generational similarities could be observed. So, every 20 years or so, a new generation comes around and is an awful lot like their corresponding generation of the last cycle. To use myself as an example, rather than single out anyone else, as a flannel-wearing member of Gen X, my equivalent, the last history cycle, would have been the lost generation of Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, General Eisenhower, and, well, Hitler. There's a lot more to this theory than I'm getting into or will get into, but I have to say now that ever since I discovered it many years ago, decades, it has been one of my favorite theories. And there's perhaps some confirmation bias going on here. Anyway, not only are people divided up into generational groups, but events largely are as well, usually caused by actions and reactions and inaction of the group triggering the particular 20 years. There are 4 turnings, as they are referred to, where things are built up, solidified, weakened, and finally broken apart so that a new system or cycle can be built on their rubble and start it all over again. Exhausting. Also, sounds kind of like the Robert Jordan book series, The Wheel of Time, which I just happened to be reading in college when I discovered Strauss-Howe Generational Theory. So, again, perhaps there's a wee bit of confirmation bias involved. Team Matt, by the way. Neil Howe has since written a new book. He's actually written a lot of books, but we're talking about the newest one, called The Fourth Turning Is Now, detailing how we are currently in the final phase of breaking down the world order, which has been in place since World War II. I mean, I think we can all agree something is going on, right? Things seem kind of unsettled, to say the least. And people are being really, really mean. The last cyclical turning for the U.S. was World War II, and this is a part of why Neil Howe thinks that the cycle continues. When the people who fixed the last great problem have all died, there's no one to stop people and say, hey, I'd just like to say that Hitler really was that bad. Personal experience, bro. Also, Stalin, he kind of sucked too. The greatest generation, as we call those who fought World War II, is largely gone. I didn't merely read about, as my grandfather referred to it, WW2. I heard first-person stories. One of the stories that absolutely tweaked my eyeballs was my grandmother's recollection of hearing that the atomic bomb had been dropped in Japan. I was fixing a roof, she said. I didn't really think about it right then. My grandfather was in the Pacific Theater at the time. Now, as evangelical for Strauss-Howe generational theory as I happen to be, there are still problems I can admit to. First and foremost, people interpret how to interpret whatever is going on and what is analogous to past people, places, and things. To me, this actually falls into Strauss-Howe theory itself. If the word fascism has lost its actual meaning, then the meaning of fascism is up for grabs. Ditto for the word communism, and I guess the word literally. Another bit to chew on from this theory, the US wasn't on the same generational cycle as Europe, but now it mostly is. I'm not quite sure how that works. Did someone have a short cycle? This current cycle was longer than others in the US. I think the wizarding world must have had a super short recent cycle because the Battle of Hogwarts was in 1998. Or are worlds with and without magic on entirely different timelines? I have questions. Anyway, to get a bit more in depth here, there are 4 turnings in a cycle. These are 1, high, which is simply a high. Things are pretty good. 2, an awakening. New values are being introduced and things get a bit bumpy, but it evens out eventually. 3, the unraveling, when the older parts of society are decaying and the new stuff is trying to edge in and take root. This, of course, lays the groundwork for 4, the crisis. Out with the old and in with the new. What this doesn't mean is that every 100 years or so, everything is reduced to rubble and we all start again in a field of apocalyptic detritus. But it doesn't not mean that either. That's what makes it all so exciting. And by exciting, I mean terrifying. But just as there are turnings in time, there are also generations of people, and these generations have a lot of characteristics in common. Not all of them by any means, but this is not a new concept. It's commonly accepted that Gen X is rather the middle child of generations, stuck in between the loudly braying boomers and millennials. In Strauss-Howe terms, Gen X is the nomad generation between the prophet and the hero generations. There's also an artist generation. So these things layer on each other to create the history of the world we live in. It's an interesting exercise in thought, even if you don't quite believe it. Neil Howe includes a very poetic quote in his most recent book by Jean Demian, a French author who wrote a particularly famous epic romantic poem in the late 1200s. In The Romance of the Rose, he said, "Peace makes plenty, plenty makes pride, pride breeds quarrel, and quarrel brings war. War brings spoil, and spoil poverty. Poverty patience, and patience peace. So peace brings war, and war brings peace." Which, when you think about it, sounds an awful lot like another little ditty we hear fairly often. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Seems like there are actually a lot of thought lines converging in this whole idea of cycles. Even Shakespeare makes a lot of reference to cycles of history, the past is prologue and the Tempest probably being the most often quoted. In King Lear, the wheel has come full circle. My favorite, though, is from one of his sonnets, with a bit cut out for brevity. Shakespeare was never short to say things. "If there be nothing new but that which hath been before, how are our brains beguiled, which, laboring for invention, bear amiss the second burden of a former child? Whether we are mended or we're better, or whether revolution be the same." In other words, are we better? Were they better? Or is it all just the same thing?
What to do